My name is Corey Akins. I'm the Senior Director of our graduate programs here at the Opus College of Business, and I wanted to welcome you to our Master's Pub tonight. I wanted to mention a couple things about M-Tech, we've called it here at St. Thomas, Emerging Technologies. At the tables, you'll see a sheet like this, and it's a collection of programming and co-curricular activities that we organize today. The Dean and I were just chatting about a great event we just had this afternoon that was down at the U.S. Bank Innovation Center. One of our alumni from St. Thomas runs that, an MBA alumni down there, hosted about 40 undergrad and graduate students along with their partners Microsoft, and they did some design thinking and innovation challenges down there. And you can see a sheet on your tables that outlines a number of other events that we have coming up as well. One of the neat ones is a stakeholder dialogue with Farhad Manju. I know he's a leader in this area as well. That's something that might be really interesting for you to check out. That's happening next week on Thursday, May 2nd. But a few a showcase is on there. There's a discussion collective that's next week as well. And a couple other things that are following this is actually our speaker is going to serve as a corporate fellow for a new elective class that we're going to announce next week that's going to run in the summer for the current students. That's Emerging Tech and Business, so you can learn about business applications of stuff like analytics, AI, machine learning, blockchain, stuff like that. And the real intent of all of this is not to turn our business students necessarily into technologists, but for them to understand technology enough to know and recognize opportunities where it can be leveraged in business and find those opportunities to do so. So there's some materials on there. There's some great swag for you as well. There's even a tumbler there. So you can arm wrestle for a tumbler in the center of the table if you want to take that home as well. You're welcome to help yourself. So again, thanks for coming. And with that, I'm going to welcome Dean Stephanie Lenway to the podium to introduce our speaker. Thanks.
Good evening. Good to see you here. For those of you streaming, I hope you have a cold beer, because everybody here does. So I'm delighted to have this opportunity to introduce Corey Ganser. He's a Tommy. Pretty cool. He grew up in Duluth, where he learned about technology by deconstructing computers in high school and putting them back together again, sort of. He came to St. Thomas. He had the insight not to study computer science, but he came to Opus and majored in entrepreneurship, which prepared him for a fabulous career in technology. With his background in entrepreneurship, Corey really had a fine-honed appreciation for the needs of the customer. And after a lengthy sojourn in California, which he may tell you about, Corey had the good sense to return to the Twin Cities, where he founded Collective Fruitions, a tech firm specializing in custom app development and agile management. Corey helps clients create cutting-edge technology using his expertise in program management, product ownership, and product management. In California, Corey did work at Apple, small company in Cupertino, where he was an engineering program manager. He oversaw R&D for software development, focused on leading projects through proof of concept stages. Corey is committed to making technology more human and more accessible to prospective users. That's why he's here today. So please join me in welcoming Corey Ganser back to St. Thomas.
Thank you. Make sure, okay, there we go. Thank you very much, Stephanie. That was a very nice intro. That will make this a short slide. So a little bit expanding on the background and profession. After St. Thomas, I worked at a startup based out of the Twin Cities, actually in St. Paul, called MindTouch. That's what got me out to California. They relocated out to San Diego. I was fortunate enough to work in multiple different facets of the company that allowed me to be exposed to not only the customer lifecycle, but also the technology. I was working and created the support department there. where we started off with on-premise deployments, then we got into virtual machines and ultimately led into a SaaS deployment. But while doing support for companies like Intel, NASA, Intuit, Department of Defense, you have to learn your stuff. You got to know what you're talking about to have the confidence and to have the know-how to support customers like that. So after that, I left MindTouch and I worked at a company called Emotion. Emotion did expression analysis. So we would take a video of your face while you were watching a stimulus, like a movie, a commercial, a video game. We'd analyze the facial action units, which are the little muscles in your face that will trigger when you're happy, sad, angry. And we process this. We then create a time series analysis, meaning that we line up your reaction with the video, and we're able to see spikes or troughs of reactions based upon the stimulus you're looking at. So an example of this, let's do a trailer of a movie. Let's put it out there. We had a funny point here and we had a sad point there. Everyone was sad at the funny point and everyone laughed at the sad point. We need to rework that trailer. This technology, we created a brand new product that was leveraging this. We put it together and launched it within 3 months and got customers excited and really amped up on it. Then we got acquired by Apple. I went into Apple and I worked in the hardware technology incubation program where we put together prototypes to present to senior executives of the future for the product lines for Apple. We would put them together, present them, and then they'd either say, yes, this looks great, or nope, back to the drawing board, and then we just keep going through that. After Apple, I worked at a company called ForcePoint, based out of Austin, but they also have a location here in Minnesota, which was all around cybersecurity. I also helped run the R&D division there, where it was quick prototyping. Within 1 month, let's put together the concept, whether it be blockchain or advanced threat detection. How do we analyze it? How do we do it? Once again, present it to the execs, get their feedback, get their input, and then either move on or try the next one. Right now, as Stephanie highlighted, I'm running my own company focused on leveraging that experience. I'm still working with Apple as a contractor, helping them out with some of that stuff, but also working with other companies as well. And last year, I started the Emerging Technology Conference based out of St. Paul. And this year, I'm fortunate enough to have it hosted here at St. Thomas, where we'll have a great group of people to talk through all these different aspects of emerging tech. And it's going to be focused on business, technology aspect of it, so it's not a tech deep. The focus is on let's break down the complex technology concepts and root it in business so that you understand what are the applications of this. So that's my background. Now let's dive into a little bit of the talk. So what is prototyping? Prototyping is ultimately, from my definition, creating an MVP, which is a minimal viable product, to verify an idea concept with a specified group of stakeholders. If you have not heard of the concept of a minimal viable product before, it's very common within the agile world. And ultimately what it means is it's a fundamental set of functionality that we need to be able to prove our point. So we want to be able to do X. What is the base functionality that we need to create in this product to be able to prove that point so that we can then decide, is this successful? Let's continue on, or nope, let's pull it back because this wasn't really what we were looking for. One thing to note, this is just a little side note, just because it's a minimal viable product does not mean it is a it's not a bad design product or a poorly performing product. It's just a minimal requirements that are needed to prove your point. And I'll get into that a little bit more as we go through this. So this is kind of my little diagram of stages of prototyping. Everything I'm going to be talking about here today is going to be more focused on software prototyping, but I'll talk a little bit or touch a little bit just on hardware prototyping where applicable. But ultimately, the stages of prototyping, as I have it, is I have an idea. I have this great idea, it's amazing, and you'll see with every single one of these steps we have a feedback loop. And that is so important, especially when you're prototyping, is to get that feedback. Talk to your stakeholders, talk to people within your organization, talk to friends, family. Is this a good idea? Is this something I'm working towards? Then we get into how to explain my idea. We get into low to no coding prototypes, and then we get into the MVP prototype. So let's break it down. The first one, I have an idea. So my inspiration. I saw the WeatherBug Sharknado forecast, and I was like, yeah, there needs to be a Sharknado forecasting app. I need to know when Sharknadoes are coming to my area. I know everybody else needs to know when Sharknadoes are coming as well. So this is a great idea. I have an idea, it's come off of some inspiration. Inspiration can be, within your own world, or it can also be coming from within your business, within your customers, etc. But Sharknado forecasting app. Is this a good idea? This is where the feedback starts to come in. You start talking to people. Is this a good idea? Should I have it? Would you use the Sharknado forecasting app? Like, is that something that would be useful? Is there a customer base for this? If I put this out there and actually start to put my app in the App Store or have advertising in it, is it going to have a sustainable model around it? Is there already a solution for this? The nice thing of it, there is already a solution for this, and since you are all kind of business people, you know that there's a proven market there. It may be saturated market, which you'll have to identify, do some market analysis around that, but they may have a market there that you can disrupt, that you can come in here, you can do it a little differently, and you can prove that point. So, you have your idea. Now, how do we explain this idea? This is a very dense slide, so I'm just going to walk through step by step. So I have 3 components to how you break down the idea that you have. You have user stories, acceptance criteria, and mocks. So the first one, user stories, this is another thing that's very unique to agile development, software development. You break it down into a way that when somebody reads the story, they can kind of put themselves into the mindset of the person they're developing this for. So in this case, the format is, as a stakeholder, I want to do something so that I can realize a benefit or value. In the case of my app, as a user of the Sharknado app, I want to enter my zip code and see if the Sharknado is near me so I can stay safe. When you hear that, like when I tell you that, you're able to understand, okay, I get what you're trying to do. The user of the app has a zip code, and they want to be able to enter this into the app, and the ultimate benefit out of it is they want to see if the Sharknado is near them so they can get out of the way. The next aspect is acceptance criteria or acceptance tests. These is the details of the user story. So if you can think of this like a index card, you write the focus point on the top of the index card, and then you have your bullet points underneath this. The acceptance criteria or acceptance tests within here are the individual details that break down your requirements into more tangibles. And this is very important because it will start to shape and form the features and functionality of your prototype. So the format, you got function definitions, you've got requirements in the UI, which will be supported by mocks, which we'll highlight in a bit, and you have restrictions. So in this case, have a text field that you can enter zip code with the search button to search. Results will be overlaid on a map to show the trajectory of the Sharknado, and only support United States postal codes. I'm going to highlight why it's important that I added some of these things a little bit later, and how if you don't add that, it can be very costly. And then the last part is mock-ups with a narrative, which I'll do some live examples just in a little bit. But before I do a live example, how do you create a mock-up? Now, you don't have to be a designer, you don't have to have a graphics design background, you just have to be able to convey your intent through pictures, through drawings. It can be back of a napkin, it can be a whiteboard, it can be a notebook, it can be anything that you can draw. You can get more expressive with it by having clickable wireframes, which I'll show that in a bit too. You can do screenshots with annotation. If you know what you want, where it's like, hey, here's a good example of it, print it off and say, not this, but this. Little things like that are huge because it breaks it down of saying, okay, I understand what you're saying. It's not just a long page where I'm trying to understand and extract your verbiage or your context into my context. I can actually see what you're pointing at. So anything that's visual that helps explain that is critical. Pictures are worth 1,000 words. Everyone knows that. All right, so let's create some mock-up. I am using Balsamiq as a tool. At the end of the presentation, I have a link that I'll share with you that gives you a ton of resources for the whole prototyping phase, from ideation to wireframing to advanced, lo-fi, hi-fi mocks, all these things. It's a very comprehensive, awesome tool, and I'll share it with you. I just found it last week. It's fantastic. But I've been using Balsamiq for about 5 or 6 years now. So this gives you a foundation so that you can create very crude representation of what you want to do. It's a wireframe. So this is a mobile app. So I'm going to start with a phone. Let me zoom that out a little bit so you can see it better. Okay, so I got my phone. Now I want a search box. Put my search box right there. I'm going to label. I want people to know what this is. Put that there. I'm going to make that bigger. People really know what it is. And I have a screenshot that I took from the video there. And I'm going to put this in here. Okay, so what did I just create? I created a smartphone application that has a search box in it with a map that shows the trajectory of the Sharknado. I just did that in less than a minute, but I'm able to convey, someone can look at this and say, oh, it's a Sharknado forecasting app. Okay, cool. And it's got a search. I don't know what the search does. What does the search do? Do you search for Sharknados? No, we don't search for Sharknados. Enter your zip code. Oh, okay, you enter your zip code. Okay, that makes sense. And then you have the map here, and it's able to convey, this is what we're doing. Like, this is how we're putting this stuff together. So next, I want to jump back in here for a second and get back into the feedback. And I'll come back to that balsamic mock in just a second. So ultimately, the feedback that's critical to this stage of the prototyping is, do these make sense? If somebody reads your user stories, your acceptance criteria, looks at your mock, do they make sense? What tweaks can be made to make it clearer, to understand? What seems irrelevant or maybe breaks the flow and just doesn't seem logical? This is where you can get into some user acceptance testing as well, where you can sit down with people and say, hey, look at this. What do you think about this? Give yourself a day when you create stuff like this to let it sink in. So what I'll typically do is I'll just kind of do a brain dump on a page, whether it be just capturing acceptance criteria or even just drawing on a whiteboard. If I draw on a whiteboard, I take a picture of it, I throw it in my notes. I come back the next day, and it gives you enough time to separate yourself from the idea that you're able to be a little bit more critical of it. You're able to understand what is not connecting with this. If I'm coming at this fresh as if somebody else presented it to me, what just isn't clicking? It's easier to be a critic than to create. That's just true. It's so much easier to critique than to create. But the big thing here, especially with software development or hardware development as well, is there anything that's not needed in here? So you're going to be, once you get to the end of this, when you actually create the MVP prototype, you're going to be handing it over to somebody to create this. This person's going to be spending their time, their energies. They're going to be reading everything that you've put together to generate this. And if there's something that they don't have to do, you don't want them doing that. You don't want them wasting time on something that isn't really going to get you closer to that MVP or is just extraneous where people go, oh, that's nice. That's a nice feature to have. If you hear someone say that's nice to have, then it's not important. It's not critical. It's not required. What you need is, that is a required functionality. I will not use this unless that feature is there. That's important feedback. So, like we were just talking about, what happens if there's impact on miscommunication? So if you don't get the user stories right, if you don't get the mocks right, if you don't convey your information right, you're going to have over-engineering. If I just said, hey, they entered their zip code, and then it shows Sharknado. Okay, well then let's start pulling in all the world postal codes. Oh, this one's a little formatted funky. Okay, we're gonna have to take different consideration for these type of character sets, and we're gonna have to have the whole world map, and we need to be able to keep this map up to date because now there's some political concerns over here that are shifting borders, so we need to make sure we take that into consideration. Nope, just United States postal codes. Great, got it. That's a determined set, we can move with that. We don't have to consider the rest of the world at this time. Mixed functionality, or missed functionality. If I didn't specify that I wanted a map overlay, then they'd just be like, oh yeah, I'll just list out where the Sharknadoes are at. So I'd be like, yeah, 5 miles from your zip code is where the next Sharknado is. Well, I want a visual representation. I want people to be able to see the map and understand where is that Sharknado in representation to myself. Impact on timeline and budget. Any unnecessary features that are generated, that means it took time. That means that took energy, that took money to generate these features, which means it's taking more time, it's taking more money, now you're over budget, and you still haven't proven your point. That's why you have to really get critical on that. And the last one, and this is really an important one, is disappointment. With any working relationship that you have within your company, it's really critical to maintain good, good rapport, good communications. If you lead somebody down a path that ultimately leads to you being disappointed because they didn't create what they want, they feel like their time's wasted, you're gonna have to rebuild that relationship. So really this disappointment is you promised the stakeholders and you're not following through on it. You had a vision and it wasn't executed. And the person that spent all that time and energy on it, especially if they're under the gun, they created what they thought you wanted and it wasn't, and then that's disappointing as well. So you can see from creating a prototype, this is the most important part of it. Before we get into the creation aspect of the MVP prototype is let's understand what it is. Let's do as much as I can. Let's sit in this world right here and understand it and get feedback from people, but internalize it, get it to the point so that when we go to hand it off, it's ready to be executed and it's clear and it's crisp. And it also saves the, hey, can we sit down in a meeting, and talk about this for the next hour, hour and a half because I don't really fully understand what this is. It cuts back on that. The more clear it is, the faster they can implement, the less ambiguity it is. But at the same time, this is features and functionality they can execute on, that they can use their technical requirements, their software. You're not telling them what and how to do it. You're telling them what you want it to look like in the end. So the next stage is low to no coding prototypes. So this is still something that you can accomplish before you get into the actual programming aspect of it. So low to no coding prototypes is, hey, even the very lowest thing. I've got 2 napkins. So I got 1 napkin, and then, now I click on this button, and now the next napkin, and this shows a different screen. That's a very, very low profile, but you can keep it as simple as possible. Whatever your technical aptitude is, stick at that level. Don't push yourself too far yet. You always have to be learning, always got to push, and that's good. But as far as being able to hit these, go with what you're comfortable with that you can convey. So let's do that quickly, and I'll show you an example of that. So I've got my Sharknado forecasting app. It's fantastic. And I realize that I need to kind of have a first screen. So I'm going to do this. Oh, I know why. Thank you. There we go. Okay, so we've got I made a duplicate of the app that I had, so I have a duplicate mock. I've got this. I'm going to put a placeholder here for where the map's going to be. And maybe I'll throw some text in here where it's be like, enter your zip code above to see a map of the Sharknadoes. I can make that a little bit. I shouldn't use a label. I should use text. There we go. All right, so we've created a first step of it, and then what we can do is I'm going to link this up to the new mock-up copy. Now the cool thing about this is I'm going to play this. All right, so I've got my Sharknado forecasting app mock. I go, okay, I come in here. What do? Well, you put your zip code in here. Oh, hey, it takes me to the next screen and it shows me what it is. I just demonstrated a very, very simple flow, but it is a flow nonetheless. You can obviously add multiple steps in there where it's like, hey, I click on this, and now it shows me a screen where it has a zip code entered in it, and then I click on search, and then it takes me to the next screen, and then I click on the map, and it does a zoom in. Depending upon how detailed you need to get into the features and functionality, you can continue doing it. But you can see how simple that was as far as clicking on an element, having it linked to the next element, and it just transitions to the next thing. Now, one of the things, being from Apple, I had the privilege of sitting in on the prototyping team, the design prototyping team at Apple, and how they approach things. So you'd think that a team of that caliber, like that, doing really, really big, important design, all this other crazy stuff, that they're going to have these like really complicated tools that make it very, hard that the average user can't do it. They leverage Keynote. So they use Keynote, which is the PowerPoint equivalent on Mac, to generate their prototypes. They're able to add elements in there, they have layers in there, so they can move things around differently, and that's how they approach it. In fact, if you look it up, if you search for WWDC, I think it was 2017, which is the Worldwide Developer Conference for Apple, and look up prototyping, I think it's a publicly available video, they'll actually walk through how they approach these things. So that's an example where it doesn't matter how complex the solution is going to be, you can still use fundamental basic tools to get to the point that you're trying to reach. So that's the low no coding profile. And let's go to the next one here. So then ultimately, then that gets into, okay, does the flow of information make sense? Is there anything unnecessary? Once again, getting back into that, is there anything I don't have to do so that people still get the value, I'm still able to prove my MVP, but I don't have to develop that? So always incorporate that in, get that feedback. And we're finally reached the point of developing an MVP. So this has been a long process, but you can see that up until this point, this right here, I can comfortably say that anybody in here, regardless of your technical aptitude, this all sits within your wheelhouse. You can create this, you can document, you can design, draw, whatever you're comfortable with, and you'll be able to convey an idea that you have. So now we're down to the MVP prototype. This is where we got to bring in the big guns. So the MVP prototype is focused on core functionality that will prove your goal. You still have to bring it back to your goal. Like, what are we trying to do? What are we trying to prove? What are we trying to get out of this? And make sure that, once again, your stories reflect that. All the functionality that you have reflects that before you get to that point. But keep that focus. Don't focus on the potential future value adds. I've been in conversations like that where you sit down and engineer and they're like, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we did that? I'm like, that'd be so cool. Don't do that right now. But let's put that here. Let's write it right here so we don't lose sight of it. Don't do it now, but that's really awesome. And that's something that can be explained on the roadmap. So it says, hey, if this MVP solves, if we get what we're trying to reach, then we'll go to the next stage. And the next stage, look at this roadmap. We already have something built out. Isn't this awesome? And then if the MVP is successful, you're getting buy-in. Buy-in is the most critical aspect of an MVP, especially if you are trying to convey a concept or you're trying to get buy-in from execs of saying, hey, I've got an idea, I want to run this project, this is going to change how we approach this, or this is really going to be a new business revenue stream for our company. I need buy-in, look at this MVP, isn't this awesome? And here's where we can take it. You get a starting point for that product, so if they go, yep, that sounds good, go for it. You go, cool, we got a starting point. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to start there. Sometimes MVPs are created very, very simplistic, where it's kind of throwaway code, meaning that you were able to get to the point you're still able to show functionality, but to architect it in a way that's scalable isn't going to be leveraging the same code that was developed. So that can also get to a point when you start talking with engineers where they're saying, where you may assume that after the MVP, they can pick up exactly where they left off with that MVP. That's not always the case. A lot of times they'll be like, nope, we got to take a step back. Now we have to have this type of scalable database infrastructure. We have to have load balancers out here to be able to handle incoming traffic. We need to have permissions in here, because right now we're just looking at it as if a single user is logging in, but we need to have accounts in here. So there's all these additional considerations that will actually take place when you go from an MVP to a product. And you're also going to get very valuable feedback from stakeholders. One thing I mentioned just about 3 slides back was when you do user acceptance testing. So this is when you sit down with somebody that would be using your app and saying, how do you feel about this flow? How does this look? What would you do when you hit this screen? What do you think I'm asking you to do when you hit this screen? Getting feedback from users, unsolicited feedback, is what's going to help drive your roadmap and really bring home ultimately the value that you're trying to establish. Unsolicited feedback from users is the best. Solicited feedback is the worst, and I'll tell you why. If I tell you that, hey, after my talk, wouldn't it be great if we all went out for dessert? And you'd be like, yeah, that would be great. Now that would only be agreeable because I mentioned it. If you brought it up and said, hey, we definitely need to go out for dessert after your talk, and they'd be like, okay, yeah, that makes sense, we can definitely do that. If you tell a customer and say, hey, wouldn't it be great if the Sharknado app also told you when your dinner was ready? And it's like, yeah, that would be pretty cool. You should totally do that. And it's like, no, that's not in the focus of what we're trying to do here. And so you wait for the unsolicited feedback of saying, what else do you think would be valuable if you're using this app? It'd be like alerts. That's a very good feedback. Yes, you would want an alert to pop up to let you know when a Sharknado is near. Any other feedback that you would have with that? Yeah, I'd like it to tie in with another service so that the Sharknado would tie in with Redfin, so I could see if there's a certain area in Redfin that has a lot of Sharknadoes around it and I don't want to buy there. It's like, yeah, that's great feedback, and we can get some really good corporate tie-in there. Yeah, good ad revenue. Sounds good. So it's that unsolicited feedback that's really important when you're talking to people and when you're going through that. I'm going to pause for a second, and I'm going to talk a little bit just about what we've seen with this and relate it a little bit to hardware, just because I had some of that background on the hardware. So with this, walking through the same path of I have an idea, how do I explain my idea, how do we create it, you're still going through similar paths. Like I'm creating a notion of a hardware design or a hardware prototype or a hardware concept. I'm using Arduino, I'm using Raspberry Pi, I'm using very basic fundamental technology with examples out there even to show that this functionality can work, not in a polished state, not in a state that maybe I'd want to productize just yet, but it's something that shows, yes, the technology is out there, I can do it, and even if I'm just piecing it together with pieces from my local technology store, I can do it under this budget. Okay, cool, that's good. Going through the no to low coding prototype, you can still do that with that, and then when you get into the MVP prototype, that's obviously where you're going to be taking the next step, and it's still not what you would productize with, but it's enough to get it to that point. And I already talked about that. Okay, and then the last thing, so the resources that I mentioned, you can write this down. It's flawlessapp.io/design tools. This has a ridiculous amount of resources on there, including tools to help leverage through the whole prototyping process. So Balsamic's on there, Adobe tools are on there, all different types of tools, some free, some paid, but it gives you that breakdown of different things that you can try and will be hitting at different points. But it also just opens you up to a whole new level of tools that you may not even realize are out there, like Sketch. If anybody's used Sketch before, if not, it's still, it's not necessarily like your average user's type of prototyping software, but it's really cool to use. You can do kind of more high fidelity prototyping within Sketch. And the last thing is my plug, Emerging Technology Conference. This June here at St. Thomas. It's going to be an awesome thing, talking about really cool stuff, very similar, very dialogue-oriented. Go to emerging.events. You'll see all the information about it. Questions? Stunned.
What's the most surprising piece of unsolicited feedback you've got that caught you off guard that seemed like you should have caught it?
That's a good question.
Sometimes you get so deep into something that you kind of miss the obvious because you're so entwined in the concept.
Yeah, I'm trying to, I just thought of one, but I can't share that one.
That's what I figured.
Because it's not a product yet.
You were presenting them for the prototype, I would say, how about using GPS location instead of tapping the system?
That's a great feedback. Why did I see? That's right there. Unsolicited feedback. That's important. That's critical. That would have made it better. Yes.
How do you facilitate compromise? It's a departmental thing when you're developing a product that stakeholder A demands that this is in direct conflict with stakeholder B, and what's your process for facilitating some sort of compromise?
It's good. So it's as a product owner, that is actually one of the product owner's responsibilities. So within Agile, product owner acts as the kind of hub to the wheel with, you have multiple spokes coming out and everyone's input's coming in. Ultimately, it's the product owner's decision in an enabled culture, meaning that the company says, yes, this is your role, that you do this. They'll be the one that will put the kind of like final say in it. But let's say, just for fun, it's the CTO versus the CEO, grudge match. And the CEO says, this is what we need to do. We need to do it this way because this is going to drive the most revenue. CTO says, nope, we need to do it this way because this is going to be the best approach from a technology standpoint. There's usually a way of combining it in a way that will satisfy requirements, but at the same time, someone will still be not as 100% satisfied. So in there, you have to be cautious. as you get into the stories, as you get into the flows, you'll be able to kind of mock things up that will take into consideration some of the requirements. But the biggest thing, at least what I've seen, is when you are dealing with discerning opinions, a lot of times is just recognizing that it is an opinion is the biggest thing. Once again, not thinking about CEOs, CTOs, they'll say their opinion regardless of if you want it or not. But for just general, working with anybody, everyone has a thought, everyone has a feedback. If someone's silent in a room and they're a critical part of the project, it's most likely they're not telling you 100% of what they're thinking about this. And that may be actually the most valuable opinion that you can get. And so with any of these things, just having an open dialogue, allowing people to provide the feedback, sometimes you can capture it, you can talk through it, you can even do a prototype of what they're talking about and talk through kind of where some of the sticky points are. They're like, well, if we do it this way, we can do that, but this might be a problem here, and this could be a concern here. And be like, do you still want to proceed with it? At the end of the day, depending upon how level or how much they outrank you, they may have the choice to say, yes, we're still going to do it that way. And he's like, okay, then that's what we do. But at least being able to spell it out, and once again, getting back to the communication aspect of it, if you don't have that miscommunication, or if you have miscommunication, then it's going to be bad for them and for you. But if you clearly spell out, this is exactly what you're asking for, correct? Yep, that's exactly what I'm asking for. Okay, well then, here's the pros and cons of that. How do you want to proceed? Any other questions? Yes.
So you said you started with an idea. When do you know it's a good idea? When do you know that it would fit within budget? At what point do you have to make that decision?
That's a good question. There is usually when I'm about into so there's ideas that can fit within budget, and you can force them to fit in budget and still hit the MVP. And then push stuff out on the roadmap and say, we'll hit this if this actually has traction. So there's ways of doing it that way. There's ways where it's kind of like, I expected this to be $5 and it's $500,000. Then that's just you got to step back and understand, why was I so off? Was there some technology that I severely underestimated? Did I not get the proper feedback when I was going through this? But ultimately, as you start to build it out, when I get into the low profile mocks of like the clickable mocks and I'm going through there, it starts to expand out some of the acceptance criteria to understand, okay, so this goes to here and then I'm dead end. And then you expand it out a little bit more. And then I get here and then a dead end. As you build those out, you'll start to see the flow and you'll start to understand, okay, I'm 10 screens deep here. This is going to take about this much man hours to put together this many screens. Okay, this is going to be a little bit tighter. How can I consolidate? Can I compress this at all? Then you'll have a little bit better idea. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, depending upon obviously the complexity of the technology, when you get into emerging tech, because it is emerging, there's some cases where it just hasn't been done before. And in those cases, you just have to throw time at it and be like, we don't know. This is probably how it's going to behave, but we don't know. And we have to do it to prove if it's going to work or not. And in fact, that's a lot of time what happens in R&D is that we take that month period. We're going to try this out. We're going to prototype it to see if this is even going to behave the way that we intend it to behave. And if it does, it's like, awesome. Here's the caveats. Here's the pros, cons. Or if it's like, nope, definitely not going to happen, at least not with the current state of technology. Yeah.
What are some of your most effective ways to get voice of customer when you don't want necessarily your message to get out to the market?
So traditionally, people will have like VIP groups of customers that are already under an NDA that are very bought into the features and functionalities that fit within either the new feature or the new product that you're doing. So that's one way. Obviously, even with an NDA, stuff can still slip out there. Sometimes it's obfuscated product mock-ups. So when you walk them through it, you don't have any logo, you don't have any branding, you have somebody third party run through the scenarios. A lot of design groups will do that. So if you use a third party user experience or user interface design company, they'll do it, not saying who they're doing it for, and they'll just be like, okay, here's a flow, what do you think about this? Would you use it for this? Not only is that beneficial for getting feedback that's not biased, it can also lead into new customers, which is very beneficial because they're like, oh, that's really cool. Let me know, whatever comes of that, and then ultimately it can turn into leads. Yes?
How do you know how do you determine the minimum of MVP?
That's a very good question. So the depending upon how you break down the requirements, the user stories that you have, there's going to be a threshold that you'll identify as an MVP. There'll be a threshold that someone else will identify as an MVP. Ultimately, budget will come into consideration of being like, okay, well, here's the MVP at $10, here's the MVP at $20, and here's the MVP at 3 months, and here's the MVP at 6 months. A lot of times, executives will be bought into the what's the cheapest and fastest that we can do this, which makes sense because like, hey, let's fail fast, fail quickly. Being able to pretty much have those tiers is how it'll work out. But ultimately, it's what is getting to the point. You'll have some kind of common statement. For me, it's like, I want the Sharknado forecasting app. If it doesn't forecast Sharknadoes, I've kind of fallen through on my goal. If it forecasts, or if it shows the forecast, but maybe it's not as elegant as I wanted it to be, it's still a good enough experience. If it's a broken experience where people try to use it and they can't use it, then it's still not an MVP. It needs to be an MVP where people can still use it so that they can provide you good feedback. Because if you have flaws or bugs within the MVP, then people are just going to be like, I wish it was better designed. I wish it was better developed. And maybe if it was, I would get a better experience out of this. Yes.
What's the next step after MVP prototype?
Yep. So typically, you present your prototype to the deciding stakeholder. Let's say that you do this within your company. You put it together, you present it to your CEO, your VP, your director, et cetera, and say, this is what we want to do. Here's how it works. What are your thoughts? Does this look good? And they'll say, yeah, this looks good. Typically, this isn't out of nowhere. There's usually some type of discussion that occurred already that is driving this initiative. But ultimately, it's to get that buy-in. The buy-in from the stakeholders, from the execs, to say, yes, we want to proceed with this. Or even if you're a startup, then it's buy-in from your customer base. Being able to have those core customers that ultimately will make up your starting off is going to be critical, because you're going to build the product based upon their kind of insight and their feedback, at the same time staying true to what your original vision is. And that's a hard balance to maintain, and a lot of times you'll have some organizations that will be like, I know better than the customer. And in some cases, they may have really good experience and they can hold on to that for a while. But eventually, you can't ignore your customer forever. And ultimately, you will alienate them if you don't listen to them. Yes?
Do you have a process for getting the no-code prototype POC versus kind of waiting and pushing to MVP?
Like how would I approach it, or?
Yeah, I think sometimes this is one no-code prototype, it's just not clean enough.
Yeah. Yeah, I've heard sometimes, depending upon what level they want it at, in the earlier prototypes, you can have recruit the help of a designer to put together nice high-profile mocks, is what they're called, which is ultimately just very pretty screenshots because there's no layers to it, there's no elements of it. And being able to click through that will usually convey enough value where people are like, I get it. Okay, I follow the flow that you're going through and I can understand it and it looks good. I really like the red in here. And it's like, that's great, whatever. We'll put red in there for you. But ultimately, that if someone's really hung up on the design aspect, then usually spend a little bit of time, make really pretty high-profile type of things of what it could look like, and then you just keep going through the same click path type of thing. Any other questions?
What have been some of your biggest takeaways you can share with the forum?
Sure. So, and I'll extend this to even beyond just to every organization, because I think this is true of a lot of organizations. The first requirements you get for any prototype that you're going to build aren't necessarily all of them. And even if you talk to all the stakeholders as you build it out and as you go through the prototyping process, you're going to discover other things that they didn't realize are critical or they assumed were in there that weren't explicitly captured. And that's why it's really important to get that feedback in there, because especially people that aren't comfortable or familiar with the software development lifecycle, they'll say, well, of course it has a login system, right? And it's like, no, we never showed a login system. Why would it have a login system? Well, because it's a software. Why wouldn't it have a login system? It's like, okay, so it sounds like you want a login system. We'll put a login system in there. There's things like that where people just assume. And so it's very good to explicitly call it out. And I've even had discussions where I'm like, if you don't see it explicitly written or shown up there, it doesn't exist. So what do you think should be there that's not there? And a lot of times that can lead to further discussions. But But sometimes it's costly mistakes too, where you are a couple weeks into it and you realize, well, we got to take a step back and we got to use a different architecture because now you're assuming this or you're expecting it to go this way.
So what you said that at some point the prototype becomes a requirement.
Sorry?
At some point the prototype becomes a requirement. You have to write down and say, like the login you did in the example. If it isn't the requirement,
Yep.
you're not going to see a login.
Correct.
But if you want it, just put it in.
Right. Yep. So that's all the acceptance criteria.
So at some point you have to make a decision. Now we're going from prototype to development or, you know,
Well, and some of it is you still have to, you be hitting, so some people launch with an MVP. They'll launch with a prototype to show. So if anybody's familiar with Eric Ries, Lean Startup, if you're not familiar with them, definitely get the book. It's fantastic. But Eric Ries is all about Lean Startup, about building an MVP, putting it out there. He's launched multiple companies or multiple ideas where he just puts the MVP out there. It's not fantastic. You know, it's not hitting all of what the competitors are hitting, but it's hitting the minimal viable requirements. And so you'll still have to hit those and you'll launch with that. And the validation is what you're going to get from people that are actually using the product. But yeah, it's still important that you need to have the requirements for the MVP captured. Any other questions? Yes?
How big of a group do you see as ideal for going through this process?
As far as stakeholders or people actually doing the work? You can do it as small as 2, which I've done. You can do it as big as, it depends on the culture of the company and the dynamics of the team. But typically, I think I've seen groups of teams, usually like 40, 20 to 40, is what they try to segment them out. Obviously, it'll depend. They can have, once again, talking about prototypes and not software actual development, because when you get into software development, you can slice it down into different components, and then you can have teams around those individual components. But for prototyping, I would say no more than 5 to 10. And I would say only that much if you start getting into where the requirements of the prototype are fairly complex. And so you need to have the kind of like subject matter experts in there to actually make the prototype functional. Yes?
You've talked a lot about the importance of the feedback that you get. I'm wondering, do you see in the future using some sort of AI as a way to garner that feedback that you don't actually have to go to a person to get?
I would say yes with an asterisk. And what I mean by that is AI can probably give you feedback on certain aspects of your design, certain flows where it can run against other software, other screenshots and be like, hey, I've analyzed 50 of the top software applications. Here's typically where the login is. Here's typically where this is. Here's typically what this is. This is the flow that you're going through. And usually that's the flow. AI will usually have some type of foundational knowledge that it's going to be based off of. As far as the requirements, though, AI is ultimately not going to be the customer, at least not right now. So it'd be getting the feedback from the person actually using it is going to be more valuable ultimately in the long term.
One final question for Corey? That Corey, not this Corey. Thanks, Corey.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.